So, welcome to this first Team Society webinar this semester. I am Sarah Heidenreich. I'm a researcher at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture, and I'm contributing to the coordination of Team Society, which is a team under NTNU Energy that focuses on social sciences and humanities research on energy and sustainability issues. Today's webinar is on renewable energy expansion and national sovereignty. The speakers are Espen and Susanne Hansen from the Department of Sociology and Political Science at NTNU. And the background for organizing this webinar today is the need for some kind of dialogue between political science and geography. And this is kind of exactly what Team Society should be about communication across disciplines. We have two discussants who are going to comment the presentation afterwards, which are Alexander Dodge and Asbjørn Karlsen from the Department of Geography. So I would now like to give the digital floor to you, Espen.
Yeah, thanks. And so I'll do the presentation, and if and when I make a mistake, Susanne may jump in and correct me. So we're happy to talk about renewable energy and sovereignty today. This is the slide was supposed to change. There we go. So this is part of a project on renewable electrification, which is supposed to end up as a special issue in political geography. And our vantage point is that in the literature, there seems to be a default assumption that sort of all good things go together. An increase in renewable energy capacity will increase the country's independence, its energy security, its sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. So our question is instead that, well, the literature is primarily about countries where security of supply is a concern, so countries that import energy. What about energy abundant countries instead? So countries where security of demand is a concern, like Norway, which is our illustrative case study here. And our argument is that in such countries, in energy abundant countries, sovereignty is not necessarily strengthened by renewables at all. Instead, it is either unaffected by renewables or adversely affected. Our problem is that we're political scientists and not geographers. And this is supposed to be for a special issue in political geography. And we've already shared the message from the editor of political geography with Asbjørn and Alexander. And the feedback is that we need to engage more with debates within geography and be more recognizable to geographers. And by all means, we're still going to be political scientists, both me and Susanne. We can't fake being geographers, but we would definitely like to get some feedback on how we can be recognizable to geographers and engage with geographers. There is a large academic literature on energy transitions as well as on energy security. But on sovereignty or energy sovereignty, it's not so much the case. We suspect that it is because energy security and sovereignty is often conflated. So sovereignty is sort of subsumed under a grander energy security definition. But we think there's something out there that has not been captured by the literature to any great extent yet. So there is an academic literature on, let's call it resource nationalism, energy nationalism, focusing on Latin America with an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist bent. So looking at, for instance, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and how they have regained control over national resources, regained their sovereignty from international capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. There's also semi-academic literature that seems to be growing pretty fast on energy sovereignty. So for instance, within the European Union think tanks reports, you see the term strategic sovereignty and strategic energy sovereignty being thrown around all the time, for instance, with respect to Russia. So the European Union is definitely sensitive to the fact that that so much of its gas and petroleum is coming from Russia. And so what to do about that, how to regain energy sovereignty versus, for instance, Russia. We saw it at Brexit, and we saw it with Trump. I even have a Trump quote for you. We don't want to let other countries take away our sovereignty and tell us what to do and how to do it. So we are fairly convinced that we're capturing here a real world trend that so far hasn't been captured to that great of an extent in the academic literature. When we say sovereignty, we mean both actual sovereignty and perceived sovereignty. So by actual sovereignty, we think of the state's actual substantive authority over a policy area. So here, obviously, energy. And that consists of both the physical side, so resource endowments, independent control over energy resources and the usage, and an institutional or a legal side, resource governance, that you need to have self-determination over the policies and laws governing energy usage. And perceived sovereignty, because sovereignty is one of these intrinsically hard to measure concepts. So perceived losses or perceived threats to sovereignty will often be as important for energy policy and policymakers as de facto or de jure losses of sovereignty. So now comes the default argument, and we've tried to sketch the default model here to the right. So the default assumption is that there's a positive association between energy and sovereignty. And our reading of the literature is that this goes through the intermediary variables of energy security and independence. So renewables will increase your energy security, and renewables will reduce, or renewable installations will reduce your dependency on other countries. By all means, there is also this tendency in the literature to throw both sovereignty and independence into the overall energy security sort of moniker. So you often have very wide, broad definitions of energy security. We have chosen to split it up and go with a minimalist definition of energy security that focuses on availability or stable and uninterrupted supply, which seems to be one source says this is part of 99% of all energy security studies. And by independence, we refer to a country's self-sufficiency in energy, both physically and institutionally. And so the result of the default argument is that through energy security and independence, renewable energy strengthens your sovereignty. It's a positive and a linear relationship. But as I alluded to before, we think that sovereignty is more than just glorified energy security. So to us, sovereignty is something more and more overarching, and something that has been overlooked by the literature. So this is a default argument, and this applies almost always to countries where security of supply is a concern. Now, our argument is a slightly different one. So here is our alternative model. What about countries where security of demand is a concern? So energy abundant countries, or countries that already have, let's say, full sovereignty, if there is such a thing. And so what we have done here is that we've switched the independence box from independence to dependence. So here instead, renewable expansion will lead to dependence, because an energy abundant country will use renewables for exports. Exports of renewable energy requires interconnectors. Interconnectors tie you to the importer, and that produces a potential for an asymmetric dependency to the importer. So there's a fear that this may institutionalize relationships based on asymmetric dependence. So for a country that is energy abundant, there's the choice of refraining from connecting to the rest of the world and taking care of its energy security, its independence, and its sovereignty concerns by itself, instead of tying itself to other countries. So this moves us from a positive and linear relationship where renewables create sovereignty to either a non-relationship or an asymptotic curve where renewable energy increases or strengthens your sovereignty until the moment that you reach what we call full sovereignty, after which there is no longer a relationship between the two. Or even more extreme, an adverse relationship, taking the form of an inverted U curve, where once again renewable energy expansion will improve your sovereignty up to the point at which you have reached full sovereignty, and after that point, your sovereignty will be weakened by further renewable expansion. Norway, as the case, is energy secure, energy independent, energy abundant, has a current surplus of renewable energy and a lot of petroleum in addition to that. So Norway is an extreme case, and in many ways sort of a reference case for a kind of work like this. And what we identify in Norway are three areas of contention that we have analyzed empirically: the Europeanization, focusing primarily on the ACER debate and the European Economic Area Agreement, subsea cables, and wind power installations. We have identified a couple of discourses in the Norwegian debate. So the default argument from the literature, once again, is that renewable strengthens energy security, independence, and ultimately sovereignty. In Norway, we don't really find any major advocates for this view. Instead, what we find in Norway is a mainstream discourse where renewables is mainly about maximizing social profits from cost-effectively utilizing natural resources. Social profits, the Norwegian translation is, or the Norwegian word is samfunnsøkonomisk lønnsomhet. Social profits is not a particularly good translation, I think. And the main advocates here have been the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the mainstream wing of the Labour Party, so most of the Labour Party, and while still in government, the Progress Party. Whereas the sovereignty discourse will instead make the claim that renewable expansion is jeopardizing Norwegian sovereignty. So this is a U-shaped relationship, the adverse sovereignty argument. And here, the main advocates have been the Centre Party, the Progress Party out of government, and the Red Party. And obviously, there are more political parties in Norway. They seem to straddle somewhere between these two discourses. And we obviously also know that there is a nature conservation discourse, but that's not relevant for the purpose of this paper. So we'll keep that out of the picture. This is a messy slide with a lot of information. Just to take you through the empirical part of the paper extremely rapidly, and the three areas, once again, Europeanization, subsea cables, and wind power. You see both the mainstream discourse and the sovereignty discourse in all these three areas. So with Europeanization, the mainstream argument would be that the Norwegian energy sector needs both ACER and the European Economic Agreement, European Economic Area Agreement, and that sovereignty is not compromised. The sovereignty argument is that ACER implies clear sovereignty abstentions, both de facto and de jure, and that it leads to an increasing asymmetry with the European Union, and that at least long-term Norway may lose control over its energy policy. The subsea cables argument, or the subsea cables area, the mainstream argument, is that electricity exports are good for the power sector, and the power sector is an important Norwegian industry. So Norway is an energy exporter, and there is nothing that makes electricity exports qualitatively different from petroleum exports. Cables are built only if socially profitable, and Norway alone decides whether cables will be built. The sovereignty argument is that with Norway potentially losing control over its energy policy, the European Union will eventually decide if Norway builds these cables. That will gradually lead to the equalization of European electricity prices, so gradually an end to cheap electricity for Norwegian industry, which will lead to bankruptcies, et cetera, et cetera. So the argument here is that preserving sovereignty is actually greener than selling green electricity to Europe. Wind power, here the mainstream argument is cost-effectively utilizing natural resources for social profits. So wind power yields cheaper electricity and lower GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And sovereignty, sort of flippantly here stated that the argument is that Stadtwerke München equals Hitler, especially in Trøndelag. But pretty much in the entire country, what we've seen with wind power installations is that wind power entrepreneurs have been accused of being traitors, that German capital is taking over the country, that Norway has become a colony to Germany or to the European Union, and there's been Nazism posters and German occupation posters, etc., etc. So clearly a lot of populist utterings or popular utterings saying that Norway is losing its self-determination, or the sort of slightly straighter version of the argument, wind power equals selling out Norwegian nature to European capital interests. And in the extension to that, Norway losing control over its energy policy means being forced to build cables, and that means ultimately being forced to install wind power to sell to the European Union for profits. Our conclusions. The default argument about renewable energy and sovereignty is challenged by two very different arguments, namely the argument that there is no relationship between the two at all, or the argument that there is even an adverse relationship between the two, so that renewable energy actually leads to a reduction in or a weakening of sovereignty. And what we see is that they both apply to Norway. What we see is that the Norwegian renewable energy policy and Norwegian energy policy, for that matter, is in the intersection between the mainstream discourse and the sovereignty discourse. You could easily say that the mainstream parties are the biggest and the sort of controlled energy policy and renewable energy policy for most of the time. But there's definitely a growing perception that renewable energy installations and exports make Norway asymmetrically dependent on the European Union and less sovereign. And these voices tend to be far more vocal, I would say, than the establishment or the mainstream voices. So it's going to be very hard for instance, I suspect that there will be a change of government based on the events last night. It will be very hard for the incoming government to, for instance, come to a clear conclusion as to how to deal with the fourth energy package, the European Union fourth energy package. The relationship between renewable energy and sovereignty is qualitatively different for energy abundant countries than it is for energy scarce countries. So our argument is that in energy abundant countries, renewable energy will jeopardize sovereignty instead of strengthen it. And there probably is something along the lines of a sovereignty balance. So there is something along the lines of a point at which, say, full sovereignty is reached, either in reality or perceived, after which stage renewable energy expansion, further renewable energy expansion does not have the effect of increasing sovereignty further. And obviously Norway is a bit of an extreme case. But we think it constitutes a reference point. So what we are suggesting is that what we suggest theoretically and what we use Norway to back up empirically is that the more energy sovereign a country is, and the more asymmetric the relationship is with other entities, whether it's countries or the European Union, the less likely it is that the default argument that renewable energy expansion leads to improved sovereignty holds. I think I'll leave it there. No, I will not leave it there. I see I have one more slide, sorry. My final slide is how to geographize this. And we have some suggestions, but we would like some more suggestions, obviously. We know that there's a geopolitics of renewable energy literature. We know that there's a resource/energy geography literature, which may be related to the resource nationalism literature. We see that every one of our three areas of contention, so Europeanization, cables and wind, have spatial dimensions and territorial dimensions, and that the asymmetry relationship with the EU might be described as spatiopolitical. We see that there's an obvious spatial and territorial dimension to how renewables relate to sovereignty as opposed to fossil fuels do. But so far from Googling geography journals, we have not really found any literature that is a perfect match for us, not in political geography and not in that many others either, or maybe even more importantly, a larger geographic debate that we sort of fit perfectly into. So now I'll leave it.
Yes, thank you very much, Espen, for this interesting presentation, and really nice to have some questions and see how our geographers who are discussants today will take on this challenge, and if they will present some solutions. Could you try to, I don't hear you, Espen. Could you try to unshare your screen?
That's what I was.
Oh. Great.
Did that work?
Then we will, yeah, it worked. Then we have Alex as our first discussant. Alex will also share some slides with you. That's why it takes a few seconds now. Yes, your slides are here. You are muted.
So thank you, Espen and Susanne, for sharing this paper with us. Really interesting. Also was quite interesting to get into the particulars of the Norwegian debate and to see the different representations of different arguments on Aker and on wind. The key finding here, the idea that energy abundance does not necessarily lead to energy sovereignty, is certainly an interesting one. Interesting within the European, particularly within the European context, but actually not that surprising if you take a global perspective on this. Take any resource, take a lot of resource abundant or energy abundant countries in the global south, and the research will tell you quite clearly that there's a negative relationship between sovereignty and control over resources. I mean, obviously there's quite different reasons for this. I mean, one key reason, of course, is that a lot of resource abundant countries don't have the access to the technology needed to turn resources into energy, or that they are dependent upon these export relationships with importing countries, or they're in geopolitically precarious positions based on where they are geographically. So Myanmar, for example, and its key hydropower resources at the same time that it's located next to Thailand, China, and India. So the idea that a energy abundant country has limited sovereignty over its own resources is not that surprising, actually. And maybe this will, I'll come back to this point a bit later, but I mean, one of my questions is why does literature from the global south, where these issues are discussed to a great extent, not come more into your paper? So because again, so the reason why I want to give you these comments is trying to at least think about what's the reviewers in political geography might comment on if you got this paper through to the review round. So I'm just trying to think about what they would comment on. Not that I'm actually a political geographer myself, I'm an economic geographer, but I'm interested in a lot of the research from political geography, especially on critical resource geography. So, so I'll come back to that question about the global south, but the first thing I want to comment on is this notion of sovereignty. And one of the things that I noticed about your use of the concept of sovereignty is that the literature that you are using to develop this concept is quite scarce. All I could see is one reference to Shelley et al., which is actually really just a 4-page review. So it to me it seemed a bit it seemed a bit scarce into actually trying to think about what actually is sovereignty, and how easily is it to define what sovereignty is, because I know in political geography, and I would imagine it's the same in political science, there's quite intense academic debate on what sovereignty actually is. So you have this definition of actual sovereignty, and you have this definition of perceived sovereignty. And I think the challenge here, and I think that the reason why the editor caught on to this was that there wasn't really much of a breakdown of what does literature actually say about sovereignty, and how can we create the connections between these debates on what sovereignty is, and how we conceptualize sovereignty, to how we conceptualize energy sovereignty. Because again, I mean, this is the journal of, the Journal of Political Geography. It's a top journal for political geographers. So I think they're going to, I think they would comment on this, certainly. So just to give you an idea of how geographers have thought about sovereignty, particularly in the past 2 decades after globalization, is the particularly what they have developed is this idea that we have to de-link the idea that sovereignty is contained within the states. Geographers have mostly criticized the state centrism of sovereignty, and they've tried to come with certain arguments that sovereignty is still applicable in a modern globalized area where everything is connected, but how sovereignty is actually practiced and works is through networks that exist beyond the state itself. So states exert the sovereignty not through what is actually contained within their own territories, but through networks that expand beyond the state itself. And therefore sovereignty is not just simply territorial in that sense. I mean, a key author on this is John Agnew in his book, Globalization and Sovereignty. You have a pretty good review by Mons in Progress of Human and Geography, and then you have other scholars like Neil Brenner. So I would encourage you to review this literature, try to see if this can help you strengthen your sort of definition of what sovereignty is. If you don't think it's helpful, then I think you should at least try to give an explanation for why you don't think it's useful to go into those particular debates that have been in the political geography circles for the last 2 decades. The editor also asked that you think more about energy and geography. There's quite a bit actually about written about energy geography and particularly in terms of nationhood and the nation states. So one example is this special issue on energy infrastructure and the fate of the nation. Several good articles there that I think you could look through. And you hinted at the self, how geographers are working with kind of conceptualizing spaces and conceptualizing the proliferation of different spaces, and we're interested in the scales at which different activities occur. So one example, you have Making Territory Through Infrastructure, where they discuss how the in the European natural gas market, the combination of regulators with specific material infrastructure and an assemblage of different both social and legal and financial aspects creates new territories through which natural gas systems operate that were once before the relic of the nation states, but now operate at new kind of territorial levels, in this case mostly focusing on the EU. So, and this comes, I think, works quite well with this discussion that you're having about the extent to which Norway is becoming Europeanized, or its energy system is becoming Europeanized as it develops these interconnectors and these different legal regulations from ACER. And also, you just have a general review, geographies of energy transition, which could be useful for you. So the third thing I wanted to comment on is, so you go and you briefly touch upon this idea of resource nationalism, and you refer to the discussions that that geographers have had about resource nationalism. And my key question for you is why you touch upon resource nationalism, but then almost kind of dismiss it in a way that it's not relevant for the debates and the discussions that are being had in Norway. And I'm sure you've taken there's a reason for that. But my key question is why is these debates and discussions on resource nationalism, which I will agree is mostly based on literature in the global south, why is this not relevant why is this not a relevant sort of conceptualization for the political debates that are being had in Norway? The idea of windmills being foreign owned, the idea that resources aren't being used to the benefits of developing Norway's own industry, for example, the discussions around environmental conservation versus adopting resources that are going to be exported. Anyways, I mean, these are sort of discussions that are also taken up in this resource nationalism. And I saw a point where you said that, well, resource nationalism usually has a anti-capitalist kind of flavor to it, but that's actually not true. I don't think. You certainly have more capitalist variants of resource nationalism, where it's not just about the state taking control, but the state allocating more resources to private local firms. And if you look at the literature, particularly from Indonesia, for example, you'll see that that the discussions on resource nationalism there are much less about anti-capitalism and more a question of state capitalism, or the state actually mediating and moderating state capitalism. So I just put some articles here that different examples of how geographers have worked with resource nationalism and sovereignty, and reviews of resource nationalism in the geography literature. So I hope that will help you at least get started in how you're going to make this more relevant for geography.
Thank you very much, Alex. These were very specific and useful, I think, suggestions for Espen. Espen and Susanne, do you have some specific questions to Alex very briefly, or should we go to Asbjørn right away? Because I think the general discussion we take after Asbjørn comments. But if you have some very specific questions, we could take them now.
Not beyond saying thanks, and there was some really good stuff here.
Great. Then Asbjørn, your comments?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Susanne and Espen. It was very interesting reading your paper. I found particularly the analysis very good. So this is promising, but it lacks some theoretical framing. particularly with regard to geography. As a researcher specialized in economic geography, I have not engaged much with the concept of sovereignty, but to understand that from the political science perspective, sovereignty relates to supreme authority within a territory, typical the nation state. And here lay perhaps also the problem that you as political scientists take the nation, including its various stakeholders, as the obvious unit of analysis, whereas geographers rather makes analysis from a multi-scalar perspective. Yes, you also include the supranational level when you talk about Europeanization, but you don't engage very much with the subnational level as I see it. So don't you think that extraction of water power at some points with energy in intensive industry in its proximity is important also, for example, for understanding why the Labour Party and also the Centre Party have a stronghold at single industry towns? This relates to materiality, I think, aspects of hydropower, which was produced and consumed in proximity, but has by grid expansion and recently by international sea cables become decoupled, which is a challenge for the historical comparative advantage of these industrial towns. So I think the materiality concept with regard to natural resources is important here. Particularly gas has been discussed by Gavin Bridge, which also Alex, I think, mentioned. So it's very much about power relation of actors in global production network. So it's a literature on global production network that might be interesting for you here. So as Alex was hinting on, I either don't find the concept sovereignty, and particularly what you call actual sovereignty, so good as an analytical concept in a globalizing world economy. I see sovereignty, or what you call perceived sovereignty, as at most as a construction or a discourse advocated by left-wing and center political parties, which is also, I think, the core of your paper. I'm rather not familiar with the concept of resource nationalism, which you touch on, but as Alex say, it may be more productive than sovereignty. I understand resource nationalism in the Norwegian, in understanding resource nationalism in a Norwegian context. Why don't you reflect more on the history of nationalism in Norway? The independence from the union with Swedes, World War II, the political battles and referendums on EU, and even the concession acts from the start of the 20th century, which you mentioned briefly, and the more recent deregulation of the energy market in the early 1990s, which you don't mention. I think it's critical juncture for the future development, and it makes a change in how politicians, industrialists, and citizens perceive electricity, from being an infrastructure for industry and welfare to a commodity sold in a market. So don't you think that Concession Act and the Energy Act are crucial institutions and also vital backdrop for the discourses on sovereignty in Norway? The sustainable transition debate rather talks about narratives, which could help you to add further nuances to your two discourses. In a recent article, we use narratives such as reducing energy costs, combating climate change, creating economic value, promoting energy security, which were productive for our analysis on legitimation of offshore wind. but I think they could also be relevant for discussing legitimation of ACER and the international sea cables. When you include the wind energy debate, you add more complexity, I think, as it involves also conservation of nature and also these NIMBY aspects. Do you think you actually need to include the case of wind energy, which I think disturbs the main narrative of your paper, which is quite comprehensive? I have also a small methodological argument. When you mention Norway as an exceptional country, you may also elaborate a little about Norway as a critical case. What would be critical to your theory and your theoretical propositions, paraphrasing Yin? So more sensitivity to both geography, history, and institution, I would expect. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asbjørn, for your great comments. Espen and Susanne, do you think you can bridge your political science paper with this input from geography? Do you have any spontaneous replies to some of the things that Alexander and Asbjørn raised?
I can, first of all, thank you very much for your very constructive feedback on our paper and for taking this seriously and really going to the core of what the reviewer or the editor has ordered us to do. I just wanted to, I have a lot to digest now and think about, but I just wanted to make a comment to one point made by Alex, and it's your regards to your third point of resource nationalism. This is something I've been thinking about, and I think I discussed this with Espen at some point, that I think we really communicate that there are layers of resource nationalism in the Norwegian debates. For instance, when it comes to windmills, when it comes to the conservation versus windmill infrastructure debates. So I think this is something that we can really, perhaps as I see it, this is where the biggest potential for including, or one of the biggest potentials for including sort of spatial discussions and a relevant geography literature is. So if you have more input on this area, then we welcome it, and others as well. Okay, Espen.
Yeah. I don't think we meant to dismiss resource nationalism. And it's nice to sort of have it confirmed and backed up by literature that you suggested to as well, that this is something that is not a new thing in the global south, and that what we're saying is the novelty of our argument is maybe European Union, Europe, the Western world, and that arguments from resource nationalism could actually be applied to, and conceptions of sovereignty from resource nationalism could actually be applied to our case. I think that could be done fairly easily. Obviously, the big problem is that we've always for every new sentence that comes in, one sentence needs to go out. It's also, you've also made it very obvious that we need to work on our notional sovereignty. And it's sobering and refreshing to get perspectives from a different field. Yes, our definition of sovereignty is state-centric. That's where we come from, and yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. No, but beyond that, I think open the floor to questions, and I'll be very happy to talk to the both of you about this later. I think Asbjørn also had a major point about materiality. I'm not quite sure how to incorporate all these things because it would make it into a 15,000 word paper, but you're obviously onto something. None of you mentioned geopolitics. Is that because you're economic geographers, not political geographers, or because our perception is sort of that geopolitics has become a huge part of political geography over the past decade or so?
Yes, I could say that. I've not been engaged so much in geopolitics as an economic geographer, but still see the relevance of it. Yeah.
But I would also say that's reflective of just my limited reading on the geopolitics part of the energy. But I know there are some key scholars like Michael Bradshaw, Gavin Bridge, that do go into sort of energy and geopolitics. So I think if you search through that literature, you'll find some good readings there. And I mean, certainly if you look into the, if you look into some of the energy questions, particularly in countries in the global south, then the geopolitical relations become a key question there.
So, but does that mean that the both of you think that the resource nationalism angle is the more obvious angle for us, if you want to geographize it?
Well, I mean, I think you discussed. I mean, you discussed this asymmetric relationship between Norway and importing countries, and these asymmetric relationships is what a lot of the scholars in the resource nationalism arena are actually looking at, and I think one of the things that you can point out also is that the way the asymmetric relationships between Norway and importing countries in the EU is a lot different than the asymmetric relationships between, for example, Myanmar and China or Indonesia. I mean, because that's where you say why this argument is important, because of how exactly would you define that asymmetric relationship, and does Norway have an asymmetric relationship? And if you think beyond Norway in the state-centric thing, and also think about Norway as a country that is continuously engaged with discussions with European partners on different energy discussions, you might ask yourself, well, is actually Norway losing its sovereignty? Do they actually don't have that much power to actually influence decision making at different levels, and also what's happening in different countries, and the way that these countries are managing their energy systems? Because I would imagine Norway does have quite a bit of say and power in some of these discussions, particularly given its role as, a key natural gas supplier to the EU and also a key energy supplier to the EU. So I think you could use that resource nationalism to both draw parallels to the global south, but also to find out what's more unique about Norway's relationship with the EU. And especially if you take that sovereignty beyond the state-centric perspective, I think you'll be able to do something like that.
I have to admit that I'm not that much into research nationalism, but if it's related to discourses, I think it could be relevant, and also how institutions are built over time through history. That would make sense for me. Yeah.
Mhm.